The rain fell in a steady, gray drizzle, smearing the high, narrow windows of Fairfield Penitentiary. Inside, the air smelled of industrial cleaner, stale bread, and simmering tension. In cell block D, Kaelen Vance moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that made him almost invisible to the guards. At 32, he carried a weary intelligence in his eyes, a stark contrast to the hollow stares around him. He was serving a 15-year stretch for armed robbery, a crime born of a single, desperate night when his younger brother's medical bills had become a mountain he couldn't climb. The brother had died anyway. The debt remained, and Kaelen had entered Fairfield with the grim acceptance of a man who believed his story was already written. But Kaelen was different. He possessed a mind that refused to rust in idleness. While other inmates traded gossip or stared at the walls, he buried himself in law books from the prison library, their pages dotted with his precise, handwritten notes. He was working his way through a paralegal correspondence course, not out of a naive hope for freedom, but because understanding the machine that had caged him was the only form of control he had left. His quiet diligence did not go unnoticed. Warden Elise Riggs was a woman who saw the prison system as a broken engine she was destined to fix. In her late 40s, with a sharp blonde bob and pantsuits that seemed armor-plated, she preached rehabilitation with the fervor of a convert. She instituted new vocational programs, expanded the library, and gave lectures about restorative justice. During one of her routine walks through the cell blocks, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm on the concrete, she stopped at Kaelen's cell. He wasn't sleeping or shouting. He was reading a dense text on appellate procedure. Intrigued, she began to ask him questions. His answers were respectful, thoughtful, and articulated an understanding of the law that surprised her. Here, she thought, was her living proof. A man not defined by his worst mistake, but capable of redemption. Soon, Kaelen was given a coveted job in the records office, a clean, quiet space far from the chaotic din of the cafeteria and yards. He filed paperwork, sorted intake forms, and enjoyed the rare luxury of relative solitude. Warden Riggs would often visit, initially to check on his progress, then to discuss the nuances of cases, then simply to talk. She spoke of her divorce, her empty house, the weight of her responsibility. He listened, a skilled and sympathetic ear. To the outside observer, it was a testament to the success of her reforms. In the closed ecosystem of the prison, however, such focused attention was a currency more valuable than cigarettes. It bred whispers, resentment, and a dangerous kind of curiosity. Kaelen knew this, and he tread carefully, believing the warden's favor was a fragile shield, a potential key to a parole hearing years down the line. He had no idea it was the first step onto a narrow, crumbling ledge high above a much darker abyss. The relationship shifted with the subtle, irrevocable force of a season changing. It began with extended evening sessions in the warden's private office, a space that felt less like a government cubicle and more like a secluded den with its plush carpet and framed degrees. Kaelen would arrive under the pretense of organizing files for a backlog audit. The guard on duty, a man named Hendricks who was deeply in debt to a bookie and receiving discreet financial aid from the warden's discretionary fund, would look the other way, finding sudden urgency in a perimeter check. For Kaelen, it was a complex calculation. The attention was flattering, a balm to the dehumanizing grind of prison life. Here was a woman of power, confiding in him, seeking his opinion. More practically, she was his golden ticket. A glowing recommendation from Warden Riggs could shave years off his sentence. He mistook her intense focus for a form of professional respect, a belief in his potential so profound it crossed conventional boundaries. He convinced himself he was in control, a player in a high-stakes game only he understood. For Elise Riggs, the motivation was a darker, more intoxicating cocktail. The prison was her kingdom, and every inmate a subject, But Kaelen was different. He was a project that had become a passion. Mentoring him from a distance was no longer enough. She craved the ultimate violation of protocol, not despite the risk, but because of it. The power dynamic was the point. In that office, she wasn't just a warden granting privileges. She was a queen exerting absolute, intimate dominion over a chosen subject. It was a secret proof of her authority, so complete she could break the cardinal rule without consequence. Their encounters were methodical, clinical in their precaution against discovery, yet emotionally charged. A touch on the shoulder while reviewing a document lasted a second too long. A conversation about a court case would drift into personal territory, voices dropping to whispers. Then, one rain-lashed night, when the prison seemed hushed and abandoned, the final professional barrier dissolved. It was not an act of passion, but one of profound, mutual exploitation disguised as connection. He saw a path to freedom. She saw living proof of her own unchecked power. Afterward, a new routine solidified. Kaelen became a ghost in the administrative wing, his movements expertly erased from the official log by a keystroke from Riggs's computer. She crafted flawless alibis, disciplinary reviews, sensitive intake interviews, to explain their private time. The prison hummed around them, oblivious. The guards on her shift, either compromised like Hendricks or cowed by her reputation, learned not to question. Kaelen walked back to his cell each time, with a mixture of triumph and deep unease. He held a secret that could destroy her, yet he felt the weight of the secret itself, a chain that bound him to her completely. He was no longer just an inmate. He was a conspirator. And in the silent, watchful world of Fairfield, conspiracies were fragile things, forever on the verge of being swallowed by the dark. The first symptom was a fatigue, so deep it felt like his bones were filled with sand. Kaelen dismissed it as stress, the mental toll of his double life. Then came the fever that came and went, and a persistent sore throat the prison clinic treated with generic lozenges. When the unexplained weight loss began, etching sharp lines into his face, the prison doctor, a weary man named Dr. Loomis, ordered a standard panel of blood tests. It was routine, part of Fairfield's health protocol. Kaelen gave his sample without a second thought. The results arrived on a Tuesday. The atmosphere in the medical wing was its usual blend of antiseptic chill and muted despair. Dr. Loomis called Kaelen in, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. The words that followed landed not with a scream, but with the silent, suffocating finality of a sealed tomb. HIV positive. The doctor continued speaking about treatments, about managing the condition, about support groups, but the sound was muffled, as if Kaelen were submerged in deep water. His mind was a frantic, scraping thing, clawing through his past. The years before prison were a blur, but he'd been tested during intake, clean. There had been no one since. No one except Elise. A cold, precise clarity burst through the panic. This was not bad luck. This was not a tragedy of his past. This was a targeted strike from his present. The affair, the secrecy, her controlled dominance, it all refocused into a monstrous new lens. Had it been a mere reckless game to her, or something more deliberate? The question echoed in the hollow space his future had once occupied. Parole, a life after bars, all of it crumbled into dust. He was now a man with 2 life sentences, one imposed by the state, the other by a virus. He knew accusation was useless. It would be his word against the respected wardens. She would deny it, and he would be labeled a bitter, manipulative inmate trying to smear his reformer champion. He would be thrown into solitary, his privileges gone, his chance at any future utterly destroyed. He needed proof. The idea formed like an ice crystal, sharp and clear. His access to the records office was his only weapon. Over the next week, he performed his duties with robotic efficiency, all while watching, waiting. He identified a guard, Officer Greeley, a man with a gambling habit visible in the constant worry on his face and the cheap, frayed edges of his uniform. Kaelen had been saving his commissary funds for years, a meager hoard for a hopeful future. Now he used it as a weapon. He approached Greeley not with a bribe, but with a business proposition during a quiet moment in a supply corridor. He needed a single sheet of paper from the warden's confidential medical file, specifically the section detailing her annual physical from 2 years prior. The amount he offered was more than Greeley could make in 3 months. The risk was astronomical, but the guard's desperate eyes calculated the odds. 2 nights later, a folded sheet of paper, photocopied from the administrative files, slipped between the pages of a legal ledger Kaelen was sorting. Alone in the storage closet he used as a makeshift study, Kaelen unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the clinical language until they found the relevant line. His blood turned to sludge in his veins. There it was, in stark, bureaucratic black and white. A positive HIV test result, dated 26 months ago. A follow-up note, 6 months later, confirmed her enrollment in a treatment management program. She had known. For over 2 years, she had known. And she had said nothing, done nothing. The paper in his hand was no longer just proof. It was a death sentence she had knowingly shared, wrapped in the deceit of intimacy and the abuse of power. The grief that followed was not hot, but desolate and absolute. The man who walked out of that closet was not the same one who entered. Kaelen Vance, the model inmate, the hopeful student, was gone. What remained was a vessel, filled with a silent, glacial rage, beginning to plot its revenge. Revenge, for Kaelen, would not be a knife in the dark. That was for impulsive, emotional men, and he had shed that skin. His vengeance needed to be a surgical strike, conducted from the sterile remove of a general directing a battle he would never physically fight. The first step was identifying his weapon. He turned his gaze away from the administrative wing and towards the chaotic, tribal heart of the prison. The yard. The Aryan vanguard controlled the weights, the drug trade in Cell Block B, and had a reputation for executing complex internal hits with chilling efficiency. They were led by a man named Bjorn, a mountain of scar tissue serving life for double homicide. Kaelen had assiduously avoided them for years, a clean inmate with no affiliations. Now he needed to create one. He began a campaign of subtle observation, learning the rhythms of their trade, the weak links in their armor. He identified Bjorn's right-hand man, a wiry strategist named Miller, as the true brain of the operation. The approach was delicate. Using the last of his commissary leverage on a different low-level inmate, Kaelen had a single, cryptic message passed to Miller during a laundry shift. The lawyer can make the state's RICO case disappear. Needs a meet. It was a bold, almost unbelievable claim, but it was the only bait that would interest a man facing decades of piled-up charges. The meeting happened in the most public yet private place, the crowded, noisy prison library. Kaelen, ostensibly researching a torch textbook, sat at a table adjacent to Miller. They did not look at each other. Words were murmured behind the covers of open books. My appeal's a dud. But my knowledge isn't. Kaelen breathed, his eyes fixed on a page about civil liabilities. I've seen your discovery files. I know the snitch, the flawed chain of evidence on the weapon. I can draft the motions that gut their case. I can be your outside counsel when I get out. And what's your price for this fairy tale? Miller muttered, pretending to cough into his fist. A single job. During the next big disturbance. It needs to look like chaos, an accident. The target is Warden Riggs. Miller was silent for a long moment. The risk was monumental. You're asking us to put our necks on the line for your personal grunt work. This isn't grunt work. It's a down payment, Kaelen said, his voice devoid of all emotion. You get me my result. I become your dedicated legal asset. Not just for you, for the whole crew. I'll front businesses, launder money, Find every loophole the law has. I'm not offering a trade. I'm offering you a future. The offer was unprecedented. An inmate with pristine records and legitimate legal skills offering himself as a permanent tool for the gang. It was a long-term investment with an immediate, bloody cost. Miller took a week to confer with Bjorn. The answer came back through the same laundered channel. A single word scrawled on a scrap of paper tucked into Kaelen's boot. Greenlit. The plan was built like one of Kaelen's legal briefs, airtight, anticipating counter-arguments. He provided crucial intelligence, the warden's schedule, the blind spot in camera 12 near her office, the access code to a maintenance corridor Riggs had foolishly mentioned was rarely patrolled after 4 p.m. The Vanguard would manufacture the riot, using a stage fight over gambling debts in the cafeteria during the shift change, when guards were most stretched. In the resulting pandemonium, 2 of their most disciplined enforcers would break away, follow Kaelen's route, and complete the contract. To the system, it would be a tragic case of a warden caught in crossfire, a martyr to the dangers of prison life. Kaelen would be in the infirmary during the chaos, having conveniently collapsed from stress, providing himself with an unshakable alibi. He handed over the final details, his mind a calm, dark lake. The trap was set. All that remained was the springing of its jaws. The riot began not with a roar, but with a sharp crack, the sound of a metal tray connecting with a skull in the crowded cafeteria. It was a perfect, choreographed spark. Accusations of a rigged card game, simmering for days under the surface, erupted into raw violence. The Vanguard's men, strategically positioned, fanned the flames. A table was overturned. A homemade shiv flashed. The chaotic tide of bodies swelled, sweeping up genuine grievances and opportunistic anger alike. Alarms blared, a deafening electronic shriek that seemed to vibrate in the teeth. Guards poured in from adjacent corridors, their batons out, shouting into radios that crackled with overlapping, panicked voices. As planned, Kaelen was not in the cafeteria. He was in the medical wing, having reported dizziness and chest pains an hour earlier. Dr. Loomis, overwhelmed by the usual afternoon complaints, had hooked him to a heart monitor and left him in a curtained bay, distracted by the escalating crisis on the prison radio. Lying on the stiff cot, Kaelen listened to the distant, muffled chaos. Each shout, each clang, was a step in his design. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in cold focus, visualizing the path his hired instruments would now be taking. In the administrative wing, the noise was a distant rumble. Warden Elise Riggs stood at her office window, watching the swirling mess in the yard below with a mix of professional concern and detached annoyance. These disruptions were a stain on her record, but they were also manageable. She trusted her procedures. She did not notice the 2 figures, moving with a predatory swiftness, slip out of the stream of inmates being herded towards lockdown and into the sterile, empty maintenance corridor behind the laundry. They moved with the key code Kaelen had provided, their footsteps silent on the concrete. Her office door was locked, but they did not knock. One man produced a slim jig made from filed-down cutlery. 10 seconds later, the lock surrendered with a soft click. The door swung inward. Elise Riggs turned from the window, her initial expression one of affronted authority. "What is the meaning of this? Get back to." The words died in her throat as she saw their eyes, flat and empty of all recognition. This was not an inmate confrontation. This was a delivery. There was no speech, no dramatic revelation of who had sent them. There was only brutal, efficient motion. One man lunged, his arms wrapping her in a bare hug from behind, a gloved hand clamping over her mouth to stifle the scream. The other stepped forward. The weapon was not a shiv, but a heavy, sock-wrapped lock. The first blow caught her temple, a sickening, dull thud. Her body went limp. The second and third blows were administrative, ensuring the contract was fulfilled. They let her slump to the plush carpet, a dark bloom spreading beneath her head, staining the gray fibers. They did not ransack the office. They took nothing. They simply melted back into the maintenance corridor, rejoining the tail end of a group of inmates being forcefully subdued by guards, their faces masks of identical, panicked submission. It was over in 90 seconds. The alarm still wailed. In the medical bay, the printout from Kaelen's heart monitor showed a steady, unremarkable rhythm. He opened his eyes as a breathless guard burst into the infirmary, yelling at Dr. Loomis about casualties. The official story began to form in that instant: a riot, a tragic accident, a warden in the wrong place at a terrible time. A wave of grim satisfaction, colder than the deepest prison stone, washed through him. Justice, in his own twisted definition, had been served. The final, fatal secret he and Elise Riggs shared was now buried with her. Or so he believed. The official investigation, as Kaelen predicted, initially pointed to random tragedy. Warden Riggs was eulogized as a martyr to the penal system's inherent dangers. The riot was blamed on gang tensions and overcrowding. For 2 tense weeks, Kaelen watched and waited from his cell, the model inmate grieving the loss of his benefactor. The Vanguard's enforcers kept their silence, secure in the belief that their legal salvation was forthcoming. But Kaelen had made one critical miscalculation. He had factored in corrupt guards, gang loyalties, and systemic apathy. He had not factored in Officer Maria Diaz. Diaz was a 10-year veteran with quiet eyes and a mind like a steel trap. She worked the administrative block and had always found the warden's relationship with Vance soft. Not romantic, but too insulated, too perfect. The riot itself felt wrong. The spark was too convenient, the violence too quickly channeled. While others accepted the chaos, Diaz began to quietly revisit the scene. She noticed something the overworked forensics team had missed: a tiny, almost invisible smudge of grease and concrete dust on the carpet near the warden's body, consistent with the maintenance tunnel floor, not the polished office. That tunnel was supposed to be locked during a lockdown. Her investigation became a ghost in the machine. She pulled security logs Riggs had not altered, seeing a pattern of Vance's records office hours that aligned a little too neatly with the warden's late stays. She tracked the gambling debts of the guard on duty that night, Hendricks, and found they had been recently and mysteriously cleared. She didn't go to her superiors. She knew the prison walls had ears. Instead, she visited the infirmary, sitting with an inmate from the Vanguard who had been badly beaten during the riot, a man terrified he was dying from internal injuries. With a promise of protection, she offered him a sliver of hope. His whispered confession was fragmented but devastating. The lawyer bought a hit, fixed their case. Diaz now had a thread. She followed it to the commissary logs, seeing the rapid depletion of Vance's once substantial account just before the riot. She compiled her evidence, the grease sample analysis she'd paid for privately, the log discrepancies, the inmate statement, the financial trail, into a concise, devastating dossier. She bypassed the prison bureaucracy entirely, driving it directly to a state investigator she knew from a past case, a man known for his disdain for prison corruption. The state's probe was swift and silent. They re-interviewed the beaten inmate with medical incentives. They flipped the guard, Hendricks, with the threat of prosecution for negligent homicide. They tore into Bjorn and Miller's legal histories, finding the nascent discussions about a mysterious legal benefactor. The conspiracy, so perfect in its prison-bound logic, unraveled under the cold light of external scrutiny. The end came at dawn. Kaelen was not pulled from his cell in a dramatic scene. Instead, as he walked to the showers, 2 state detectives in plain clothes and 4 correctional officers from a different facility met him in the hall. They cuffed him, not with the usual rough haste, but with a deliberate, procedural coldness. They recited new charges: conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder. As they led him away, past cells where inmates pressed their faces to the bars in silent witness, Kaelen saw Officer Diaz standing at the control station. She didn't smirk or glare. She simply met his eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of triumph, but of closure. She had solved her puzzle. The final twist was not in the crime, but in the consequence. Kaelen Vance, who had traded a 15-year sentence for a virus and a vengeance, now faced life without the possibility of parole. The warden's secret died with her, unacknowledged by the court, a hidden poison at the root of the case. The reformer was buried a hero. The model inmate was condemned a mastermind. And Fairfield Penitentiary, under new management, continued its endless, gray rhythm, its walls holding a new, more profound silence, the silence of a story almost perfectly told, undone by the one person who believed in the weight of a dust smudge and the fear in a dying man's eyes.